Far beyond the last village on a lonely stretch of stormy coastline stood a lighthouse that sailors refused to look at after sunset. During the day, it appeared almost ordinary, a tall stone tower rising from black cliffs, battered by years of wind and salt. But when darkness covered the sea, the lighthouse became something else. Its beams swept across the waves every few seconds. Yet the people who lived nearby believed the light was not guiding ships to safety. They believed it was calling something from the deep. For generations, fishermen had whispered the same legend. Long before the lighthouse was built, a small coastal village stood beneath those cliffs. The villagers depended on the sea, but the sea had always been dangerous. One winter, a terrible storm arrived without warning. The waves became so violent that every fishing boat was ordered to remain on shore. But one boat ignored the warning. It belonged to a young fisherman named Elias Vale. Elias was known throughout the village as a brave man who feared very little. That evening, however, he did not go to sea for money or adventure. He went because his younger brother had disappeared during a fishing trip the previous day, and Elias was convinced that he was still alive. Before leaving, an old woman named Mara stopped him near the harbor. "Do not follow the light," she warned. Elias looked toward the cliffs. "There is no light," he replied. Mara shook her head. "Not yet." Elias thought the old woman was frightened by the storm. He thanked her and climbed aboard his boat. Hours later, the storm became so violent that the village could no longer see the sea. Lightning tore through the clouds, revealing enormous waves crashing against the cliffs. Then, through the darkness, the villagers saw something strange. A light appeared at the top of the cliffs. There had never been a lighthouse there. The light moved slowly across the ocean, sweeping over the waves as if searching for something. And then Elias's boat appeared inside the beam. For a few seconds, everyone at the harbor could see it. Then the light disappeared. So did the boat. Elias never returned. The villagers searched for days, but they found only broken pieces of wood floating near the rocks. After that night, people began claiming that the strange light appeared whenever someone was about to disappear at sea. Years passed. The village grew larger, and the old legend slowly became something people told children to frighten them. But sailors still avoided the cliffs whenever possible. Then, almost 30 years later, the government announced plans to build a lighthouse on the exact place where the mysterious light had first appeared. The villagers protested. They told the engineers about Elias. They told them about the disappearing boats. They told them never to build on those cliffs. The engineers laughed at the stories. To them, the legend was nothing more than superstition. Construction began. Workers arrived with stone, iron, timber, and equipment. But almost immediately, strange things began happening. Tools disappeared. Ropes were found cut. Workers claimed they heard footsteps inside the unfinished tower at night. One man even insisted that he had seen wet footprints leading up the stairs. There was only one problem. The tower had no roof yet. Rain could have entered from above, but the footprints were completely dry around them. Still, construction continued. After 2 years, the lighthouse was finished. It stood nearly 100 feet above the cliffs. Its lantern was powerful enough to be seen miles across the ocean. The first lighthouse keeper was a quiet man named Thomas Reed. Thomas had spent most of his life working around ships and believed in facts, measurements, and machinery. He had heard the legend before accepting the position, but he didn't believe a word of it. On his first evening inside the lighthouse, Thomas climbed the spiral staircase and entered the lantern room. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly beneath a darkening sky. He switched on the lamp. A powerful beam swept across the sea. Once, twice, 3 times. Thomas smiled. "That's all there is to it," he whispered. But at exactly midnight, the light stopped. Thomas checked the machinery. Everything was working. Yet the beam remained fixed toward the darkest part of the ocean. Thomas tried to turn the mechanism manually. It wouldn't move. Then he heard something. A knock. 3 slow knocks against the glass. Thomas froze. The lantern room was dozens of feet above the ground. There was nowhere for anyone to stand outside. Another 3 knocks followed. Thomas slowly approached the window. At first, he saw nothing. Then lightning flashed. For one brief moment, Thomas saw a figure standing on the rocks far below. A man, soaked from head to toe, staring directly at the lighthouse. Thomas blinked. The figure was gone. The next morning, Thomas told himself it had been a trick of the storm. But when he went outside, he found something lying near the lighthouse door. A piece of old wood. Carved into it were 3 words: "Bring him home." Thomas recognized the name written beneath them: Elias Vale. From that day forward, the lighthouse began behaving strangely. Every night at midnight, the beam stopped turning and pointed toward the same area of ocean. Thomas marked the direction on a map. It always pointed toward the place where Elias's boat had disappeared. He became obsessed. He searched old records and discovered something disturbing. The lighthouse had not been built there because the location was ideal for navigation. It had been built there because the government surveyors believed the cliffs were the safest place for a powerful light. But the original survey contained a handwritten note. Thomas found it hidden inside an old archive. Local fishermen strongly oppose construction. They claim the location is cursed. Beneath it was another sentence. The old legend may have originated from a shipwreck occurring during an unexplained coastal phenomenon. Thomas began investigating the history of Elias Vale. Eventually, he found a newspaper article from 30 years earlier. It described Elias's disappearance. But there was something the villagers had forgotten. Elias had not been alone. His younger brother, Daniel, had disappeared the previous day. And according to the article, Elias had gone into the storm because he believed Daniel had survived. Thomas suddenly understood why the words had appeared. Bring him home. Perhaps the legend was not about death. Perhaps it was about someone who had never been found. Thomas returned to the lighthouse that night with an old map. The storm was approaching. As midnight came closer, the wind began shaking the tower. The lamp turned. Once, twice, then stopped. Again, it pointed toward the same distant section of ocean. Thomas grabbed a lantern and climbed down the tower. Outside, waves crashed against the cliffs. Then he saw something between the rocks. A small wooden boat. It had appeared from nowhere. Thomas approached carefully. Inside the boat was an old metal box. He opened it. Inside were photographs, letters, and a rusted compass. The final letter was written by Elias. Thomas read it beneath the lighthouse beam. The letter explained everything. Elias had found Daniel alive after the first storm, but their boat had been trapped inside a hidden sea cave beneath the cliffs. Elias had managed to escape briefly, but the cave collapsed before he could return. Daniel had remained trapped inside. Elias had gone back for him. Neither brother was ever seen again. The terrifying legend had been born from a misunderstanding. The strange light people had seen that night had not been a ghost. It had been a reflection from a powerful storm phenomenon illuminating the cliffs. But something else remained unexplained. Why had the lighthouse beam always pointed toward the cave? Thomas followed the direction of the light. He discovered a narrow passage between the rocks. Inside was a cave. And deep within that cave, beneath layers of stone and sand, he found the remains of an old boat. There were 2 skeletons inside. Thomas immediately contacted the authorities. The remains were recovered. The villagers finally learned what had happened to Elias and Daniel. For the first time in decades, the legend was given an ending. The brothers were buried together on a hill overlooking the sea. After the funeral, something unexpected happened. The lighthouse changed. That night, Thomas climbed into the lantern room. The storm had passed. The ocean was calm. The lamp began turning normally. For the first time since the lighthouse had been built, the beam no longer stopped over the dark water. It swept across the horizon peacefully. Thomas stood silently at the window. Then he heard 3 soft knocks. He looked toward the glass. Nothing was there. But when he turned back toward the sea, he saw 2 faint lights moving together across the distant water. They remained visible for only a few seconds. Then they disappeared beyond the horizon. Thomas smiled. The legend was finally over. Or so he thought. Years later, when Thomas retired, another lighthouse keeper took his place. Before leaving, Thomas gave him one warning. "If you ever hear 3 knocks at midnight," he said, "don't be afraid." The new keeper laughed. "What should I do?" Thomas looked toward the ocean. Just remember that sometimes the sea doesn't want to frighten you. He paused. Sometimes it wants you to remember. The lighthouse still stands today, surrounded by crashing waves and endless darkness. Sailors still see its beams sweeping across the water. Most believe it is simply a lighthouse doing what it was built to do. But some fishermen claim that on the darkest nights, when the fog becomes thick and the sea becomes completely silent, the beam sometimes pauses for a few seconds. And when it does, they say you can hear something beneath the wind. 3 quiet knocks. Then another 3. As if someone, somewhere beyond the waves, is still asking to be remembered. Maybe the old legend was never about a monster beneath the sea. Maybe it was never about a curse. Maybe it was simply the story of 2 brothers who disappeared, and a lighthouse that refused to let their story disappear with them. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing about old places. They don't always keep ghosts. Sometimes, they keep memories. If you enjoyed this mysterious lighthouse story, don't forget to subscribe to Whispering Walls and turn on notifications. There are countless forgotten buildings, abandoned places, and mysterious legends waiting to be uncovered, and the next story may be even stranger than this one. Because some walls whisper, some ruins remember, and some lights never stop searching.